On the morning of the 3rd of August 1944, a German reconnaissance patrol near Villa Bocage reported engaging what they classified as leichte Panzerwagen, light armoured cars. Their after-action report noted armour-piercing rounds required, estimated crew of 3 to 4, and advised infantry to maintain distance of at least 200 metres. They were describing Willys MB Jeeps. Specifically, they were describing American-built reconnaissance vehicles weighing 1,090 kilograms, constructed almost entirely of unarmoured steel and canvas, with metal so thin, a German NCO later claimed he could punch through the bonnet with my fist. These vehicles had no business being classified as armoured fighting vehicles. They had no business surviving engagement with proper German reconnaissance units, and they certainly had no business making German infantry think twice about approaching them. Yet by autumn 1944, British forces in northwest Europe had converted hundreds of damaged, worn out or beyond economical repair jeeps into what soldiers called battle wagons or gun jeeps, improvised fighting vehicles that German forces consistently overestimated, avoided when possible, and treated with a caution usually reserved for actual armoured cars. This wasn't desperation. This was doctrine. The jeeps that became battle wagons were, almost without exception, vehicles that should have been scrapped. But British workshop crews discovered something. A jeep too damaged for reconnaissance work could still become something far more useful than a pile of spare parts. What appeared to be making the best of bad luck was actually exploiting a principle British forces had learned in North Africa. On a chaotic battlefield, the appearance of capability matters almost as much as capability itself. Standard military logistics thinking in 1944 emphasised returning damaged vehicles to depot-level workshops for proper rebuilding or, if too far gone, stripping for parts. The Willys MB Jeep, designated Truck 1/4 ton 4x4 in British service, had a remarkably simple mechanical layout, and 134.2 cubic inch, 2.2 litre, 4-cylinder engine producing 60 horsepower, a 3-speed gearbox with 2-speed transfer case, and a suspension consisting of semi-elliptic leaf springs front and rear. Parts were supposed to be interchangeable, repairs were supposed to be straightforward. A properly maintained Jeep should last through the entire campaign. The reality of combat in northwest Europe showed something different. Jeeps arrived in theatre with their odometers already showing 3,000 to 5,000 miles from depot to port to unit. Then they entered combat conditions. A reconnaissance jeep for the 11th Armoured Division might cover 80 to 120 miles per day on roads that varied from pre-war French tarmac to muddy farm tracks to rubble-strewn urban streets to, most damaging of all, cross-country pursuit of retreating German forces across fields never meant for vehicles. By October 1944, the average jeep in a British armoured reconnaissance regiment had covered over 15,000 miles. The War Office considered 20,000 miles a reasonable service life before major overhaul. But major overhaul meant shipping the vehicle back to base workshops, waiting weeks for parts, and leaving the unit short of transport. A jeep with a cracked engine block wasn't worth shipping to depot. A jeep with structural damage to the chassis from mine blast or artillery near miss wasn't economically repairable. A jeep that had taken machine gun fire through the engine compartment might have a serviceable engine but a radiator, fuel pump, carburettor and electrical system all requiring replacement. More work than it was worth. These vehicles accumulated at unit workshops. By September 1944, a typical British armoured division had 20 to 30 jeeps, awaiting either depot return or scrapping. What British workshop crews noticed was this. Whilst the front end might be destroyed, the chassis rails were often intact. Whilst the engine might be beyond repair, the transmission and axles usually worked fine. Whilst the bodywork might be shot full of holes, the frame and suspension could handle weight. These weren't proper vehicles anymore, but they were proper platforms. The secret was in what military bureaucracy classified as damaged beyond economical repair versus what soldiers classified as still has 4 wheels and an engine. a Jeep officially written off because it needed 45 pounds of depot-level repairs could receive 5 pounds worth of field modifications and become a weapons platform that German forces treated with the same respect they gave to Humber armoured cars costing 20 times as much. The standard conversion process, documented in a November 1944 workshop report from the Guards Armoured Division, worked like this. Remove everything from the Jeep that was damaged or unnecessary. This meant seats, windscreen frame, canvas top, doors, and often the entire bonnet and front wings. What remained was a bare chassis on 4 wheels with an engine, transmission and controls. Weight of the stripped chassis, approximately 680 kilograms. Load-bearing capacity of the standard suspension, officially 363 kilograms payload. Actual capacity before the springs bottomed out, closer to 500 kilograms if you didn't mind a harsh ride. Then mount weapons. The standard fit became 1.303 Vickers K gun mounted on a pedestal forward of the driver, operated by a front gunner standing in the space where the passenger seat had been, and 1.50 calibre Browning M, 2 heavy machine gun mounted on a pedestal in the rear cargo area, operated by a rear gunner standing on a wooden platform. The Vickers K weighed 10.5 kilograms and fired at 950 rounds per minute. The Browning M2 weighed 38 kilograms for the gun, another 20 kilograms for the mount, and fired at 450 to 550 rounds per minute. Add 1,000 rounds of .303 ammunition at 7.7 kilograms per 100 rounds, and 500 rounds of .50 caliber at 17 kilograms per 100 rounds. Add the weight of 2 gunners, 1 driver, and typically a 4th crew member serving as commander and loader. Call it 300 kilograms of personnel, add improvised armour. This is where it got interesting. Official doctrine said don't add armour to unarmoured vehicles. You exceed the suspension design limits, overstress the engine, ruin the handling, and provide only an illusion of protection whilst making the vehicle more dangerous to its crew. Every part of that was correct. British workshop crews added armour anyway. They added it cleverly. A full protective shield for the driver would weigh 80 to 100 kilograms and make the vehicle nose heavy. Instead, they welded a simple angled plate in front of the driver, roughly 60 centimeters wide and 45 centimeters tall, made from 6mm mild steel plate salvaged from destroyed vehicles, knocked out German equipment, or in some cases simply pinched from Royal Engineers stockpiles. This plate weighed about 15 kilograms. It would stop rifle caliber rounds and shell fragments. It would not stop armour-piercing rounds or anything heavier than a Mauser. But from 50 meters away, it looked like proper armour. Around the gunner positions, crews welded similar plates creating a semicircular shield. These weren't continuous. That would add too much weight. Instead, they were sections of plate with gaps, creating the visual impression of armoured protection whilst keeping weight manageable. Total armour weight, 40 to 60 kilograms. Total vehicle weight fully loaded, approximately 1,100 to 1,200 kilograms. Still within the limits of what the Jeep suspension could handle, though the ride quality was appalling. The weapons mounting was crude but effective. The Vickers K sat on a pedestal mount welded directly to the chassis, with a simple ring allowing traverse. The .50 caliber mounting required more thought because of the gun's weight and recoil. Workshop crews typically fabricated a pintle mount with a heavy base plate welded to reinforce sections of the chassis, with the gun mounted on a post that allowed roughly 60 degrees of traverse and 45 degrees of elevation. The whole assembly would shift slightly with each shot, the chassis flexing, but it held together. What made this work wasn't any single feature, but rather the systematic exploitation of what the Jeep already did well. The Willys MB had been designed as a light reconnaissance vehicle, with excellent power-to-weight ratio, good cross-country mobility, and simple mechanical layout. Take away the requirements for passenger comfort, weather protection, and economical repair, and you had a platform that could absorb modifications the designers never intended. The chassis flex that would be a problem in a proper fighting vehicle actually helped absorb recoil. The high ground clearance that made the Jeep easy to spot also provided excellent fields of fire. The simple mechanical systems meant a crew could keep it running with basic tools. Critics argued these conversions were makeshift solutions that would collapse under combat conditions. They were right about the improvised nature. They were completely wrong about the combat effectiveness. On 14th October 1944, a reconnaissance troop from the 2nd Battalion, Welsh Guards, operating in support of 8th Corps near Venlo, encountered a German position that demonstrated exactly why these battle wagons worked. The troop consisted of 4 vehicles, 2 Humber scout cars, 1 Daimler armoured car, and 1 converted Jeep battle wagon crewed by Guardsman Davies, driver, Thomas, front gun, Williams, rear gun, and Lance Corporal Jenkins, commander. The Humbers were proper scout cars, 3 tons, 6mm of armour, 1.303 Bren gun. The Daimler was a proper armoured car, 7.5 tons, 60mm of armour, 1 2-pounder gun. The Jeep weighed just over a ton and was protected by what Jenkins later described as some plates we welded on that might stop a stern look. The German position was a roadblock consisting of a GFZ 222 armoured car, 4.8 tons, 8mm armour, 20mm cannon, approximately 30 infantry from the Volksgrenadier Regiment, 2 MG 42 machine gun positions and 1 37mm pack anti-tank gun. Standard tactical thinking said the British should engage with the Daimler, whilst the scout cars provided flank security and the Jeep stayed well back, as it had no business in a fight with proper military equipment. What actually happened was this. The German 20mm cannon engaged the Daimler at approximately 400 metres, scoring 2 hits that didn't penetrate, but convinced the Daimler commander to pull back to hull down position. The Humbers attempted to flank but came under accurate rifle and machine gun fire. The Jeep, which German forces had apparently classified as another scout car based on its profile, drove directly toward the position at 35 miles per hour, whilst both gunners engaged. The Vickers K raked the roadblock with .303 fire. Not effective against the armoured car, but extremely effective at keeping the infantry down and suppressing the machine gun positions. The .50 calibre Browning engaged the SDKFZ 222 at 200 metres. A .50 calibre round will not penetrate 8mm of face-hardened armour plate under most circumstances, but the SDKFZ 222 had vision ports, a turret ring, and thin armour on the top and rear. Williams fired 47 rounds in approximately 8 seconds. At least 4 struck the armoured car. 1 penetrated the vision port. The German crew bailed out. With their armoured support gone and under continuous fire from what they believed was a purpose-built fighting vehicle, the German infantry withdrew. The Jeep took multiple hits. Post-action inspection found 11 bullet strikes. 3 had hit the improvised armour and stopped. 8 had passed through the unarmoured portions of the vehicle. 1 had struck the water tank mounted on the side, a modification for extended operations. 1 had passed through the canvas bedroll tied to the rear. None had hit the crew or any critical mechanical component. The Jeep remained operational. Lance Corporal Jenkins's after-action report noted, "The Jerrys seemed confused about what we were. They put some rounds into us but didn't bring up the pack gun, which would have done for us properly. I think they thought we were more dangerous than we actually were." The German unit's captured log, recovered 3 days later when the position was overrun, referred to the engagement as involving mehrere Panzersperrwagen, several armoured scout cars. This pattern repeated throughout the autumn campaign. On the 23rd of October, a Jeep battle wagon from the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment engaged a German staff car at 150 metres, killing or wounding all occupants with .50 calibre fire. The vehicle was carrying the operations officer and complete tactical maps for a Panzergrenadier regiment. On 4th November, 2 Jeep battle wagons provided fire support for an infantry assault near Geilenkirchen, suppressing 3 machine gun positions and a mortar team. On 19th November, a single Jeep held a road junction against German counterattack for 17 minutes, firing 800 rounds of mixed .303 and .50 calibre ammunition, before withdrawing when it ran low on ammunition. In each case, German forces treated the jeeps with caution disproportionate to their actual protective capability. This wasn't accidental. British forces weren't just mounting guns on jeeps, they were creating vehicles that exploited German tactical doctrine and recognition training. Wehrmacht reconnaissance forces in 1944 were trained to quickly identify vehicle types based on silhouette, sound and firepower. A proper armoured car had a distinctive profile: enclosed hull, turret, heavier suspension. But a Jeep battle wagon, with its improvised armour plates, elevated weapon positions and crew in standing positions, presented a confusing silhouette. From 200 to 300 metres, typical engagement range for reconnaissance elements, it didn't look quite like a Jeep. The armour plates, even though thin, created shadows and angles similar to proper armoured vehicles. The weapons mounting, particularly the elevated .50 calibre, gave an impression of a turret or fighting position. More importantly, it fought like an armoured vehicle. German tactical doctrine emphasised identifying enemy capabilities by observing their behaviour. A Jeep should run away when engaged. A Jeep should avoid combat. A Jeep should not drive toward enemy positions whilst firing heavy weapons. The battle wagons did exactly what armoured reconnaissance vehicles did. They pressed forward, they engaged with heavy weapons, they operated aggressively. German forces drew the logical conclusion: these must be proper fighting vehicles. The sound added to the confusion. The Willys MB engine produced a distinctive high-pitched note at speed, quite different from the deeper sound of British armoured car engines. But in combat, with weapons firing, engines under load, and the general chaos of engagement, vehicle identification by sound became difficult. The heavy, distinctive thump of the .50 calibre Browning, 450 rounds per minute, each creating a sharp crack, was the same sound made by .50 calibre guns on proper armoured vehicles. If it sounds like an armoured car and shoots like an armoured car, treat it like an armoured car. The German recognition manual Taschenbuch für die Truppe 1944 included detailed illustrations of British armoured vehicles, but naturally didn't include improvised conversions that weren't supposed to exist. German forces encountering battle wagons were seeing something not in their manual that combined familiar elements, Jeep chassis, with unexpected elements, armour, heavy weapons, aggressive tactics, into something they classified as light armoured car because that was the closest match to what their training covered. Captured German soldiers consistently described the battle wagons as more dangerous than they actually were. A Gefreiter from the 176th Infantry Division, captured near Overloon in October 1944, stated, "The small English tanks with open tops, they are very fast and they appear suddenly. The armour is thin, but the guns are heavy." He wasn't describing tanks, he was describing jeeps. A Feldwebel from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division described them as leichte Spähwagen mit schwerer Bewaffnung, light reconnaissance vehicles with heavy armament, and recommended his men maintain distance and engage with anti-tank weapons rather than small arms. This was exactly the reaction British forces wanted. German infantry wasting anti-tank capability on targets that weren't tanks. What made this work wasn't clever engineering. The conversions were crude by any technical standard. What made this work was understanding the difference between what looks good in peacetime testing versus what works in the chaos of actual combat. British forces had learned this lesson repeatedly. In North Africa with improvised gun trucks, in Italy with ad hoc armour modifications, and now in Northwest Europe with Jeep battle wagons. The principle was simple. On a confused battlefield, perception is a weapon. If enemy forces think you're more dangerous than you are, they fight accordingly, they take cover when they might advance, they call for heavy weapons when small arms would do, they report your presence as a significant threat, causing their commanders to commit forces to deal with you. A Jeep battle wagon that looked like it might be an armoured car, that fought like an armoured car, and that appeared in places armoured cars might be, caused German forces to respond as if it were an armoured car. This tied up attention and resources disproportionate to the vehicle's actual capability. British commanders understood this intuitively because they'd been on the receiving end of the same principle. Early in the North Africa campaign, German forces had used similar tactics with improvised vehicles, including mounting captured weapons on civilian lorries and creating false radio traffic suggesting larger forces than actually present. The principle wasn't deception in the traditional sense. The battle wagons were real vehicles with real weapons causing real casualties, but they created an impression of capability that exceeded their actual protection and firepower. The technical simplicity helped rather than hindered this. A battle wagon conversion took approximately 12 to 16 hours of workshop time, used materials that were available at unit level, and required no special tools or expertise beyond basic welding. This meant units could create them as needed, repair them quickly, and replace them easily. A proper armoured car damaged in combat might wait days or weeks for depot-level repair. A battle wagon could be rebuilt in a day. When a Jeep was written off, its weapons and armour plates could be transferred to another damaged chassis. The entire system was sustainable with field-level resources. The crews were equally pragmatic. Drivers learned to handle the overloaded, badly balanced vehicles with techniques that would horrify peacetime instructors, approaching corners wide, braking early, accepting that the vehicle would lean alarmingly but wouldn't quite tip over. Gunners learned to fire in short bursts because sustained fire would overheat the weapons and break the improvised mountings. Commanders learned to position the vehicles where their apparent capability mattered more than their actual protection. On flanks where they created uncertainty, at road junctions where they projected force, in support of infantry where their firepower was useful and their vulnerability less critical. By December 1944, British Second Army had approximately 280 Jeep battle wagons in service across various units. This wasn't official. The vehicles weren't on formal establishment lists. They didn't appear in official strength returns. But internal workshop records and unit war diaries document their existence and use. The Guards Armoured Division alone operated 31 battle wagons across its reconnaissance elements. The 11th Armoured Division had 24 independent reconnaissance regiments and infantry brigades accounted for the rest. The conversion rate was remarkable. British forces in northwest Europe had written off approximately 840 Jeeps by December 1944 due to combat damage or mechanical failure beyond unit-level repair. Of these, roughly one-third were converted into battle wagons rather than stripped for parts or sent to depot. The determining factor was usually whether the chassis and suspension were intact. The Jeep with a destroyed engine but sound chassis was a candidate. The Jeep with mine damage to the axles was not. The tactical impact was measured not in enemy vehicles destroyed, though battle wagons were credited with at least 12 German armoured vehicles knocked out or abandoned, plus numerous soft-skinned vehicles and infantry positions suppressed, but in how German forces allocated their resources. When German reconnaissance elements reported contact with armoured scout cars, their commands responded accordingly. This meant heavier weapons deployed, more cautious approaches, and time spent treating a threat as more serious than it actually was. A captured German operations order from December 1944, recovered from the 89th Infantry Division, included this guidance. British reconnaissance elements include both genuine armoured vehicles and armed jeeps modified to appear as armoured vehicles. Distinction is difficult at combat ranges. Engage all British reconnaissance vehicles with anti-tank weapons where available. This guidance, treating all British reconnaissance as armoured threats, was exactly the reaction British forces had hoped for. It meant German infantry were using precious Panzerfaust rounds on vehicles with no armour. It meant German anti-tank guns were engaging targets that required only machine gun fire. It meant German tactical planning assumed British reconnaissance capability was heavier than it actually was. The loss rate for battle wagons was high, but acceptable. Of the approximately 280 vehicles in service by December 1944, 73 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair by war's end in May 1945. This represented a 26% loss rate over roughly 5 months of combat. For comparison, British armoured car losses in the same period were approximately 18%. The battle wagons were more vulnerable, as expected, but their losses were manageable because they were created from vehicles already written off. Each battle wagon lost had already been classified as beyond economical repair before its conversion. Its loss was, in administrative terms, no loss at all. The Jeep battle wagons weren't a major weapon system. They didn't change the outcome of campaigns. They didn't revolutionise armoured warfare. What they demonstrated was a principle that British forces had learned through hard experience. Proper equipment used properly will usually defeat improvised equipment used improperly, but improvised equipment used cleverly can be remarkably effective against proper equipment used predictably. German forces in 1944 were fighting by the doctrines they'd developed in earlier years of the war. Doctrines built around clear classification of vehicles, standardized responses to threats, and tactical procedures designed for armies with complete equipment sets. These doctrines worked well when both sides fought with standard equipment in predictable ways. They worked less well against an opponent who understood those doctrines and deliberately created equipment that exploited their assumptions. The battle wagons exploited the gap between German tactical training and battlefield reality. They looked enough like armoured vehicles to trigger armoured vehicle responses, but they were cheap enough and simple enough to build in field workshops from written-off hulks. They provided enough firepower to be genuinely useful in combat, but their real value was in how enemy forces reacted to them. This wasn't deception. This was understanding that on a chaotic battlefield, an enemy's perception of your capabilities matters as much as your actual capabilities, and sometimes perception can be manufactured more quickly than capability. British workshop crews building battle wagons weren't trying to create proper fighting vehicles. They were trying to create vehicles that would be useful in actual combat conditions, whilst exploiting enemy doctrine and recognition training. The technical specifications didn't matter as much as the tactical effect. A vehicle that would fail every peacetime design review, but that caused enemy forces to commit anti-tank weapons and treat British reconnaissance elements with exaggerated caution was, in practical terms, a successful design. This is what made the battle wagons work. They weren't built to specifications, they were built to exploit circumstances. The circumstances were that British forces had damaged jeeps that would otherwise be scrapped, that German forces had recognition training based on standard vehicles, and that battlefields were chaotic enough that a vehicle that looked threatening from 200 meters could create tactical effects disproportionate to its actual protection. The battle wagons existed in the gap between what military bureaucracy planned for and what soldiers needed. Built by workshop crews who understood that sometimes the answer isn't better equipment, but more creative use of the equipment you've already written off. By war's end, the battle wagons had become common enough that replacement crews and new workshop personnel were trained in their conversion procedures. The techniques were documented in unit technical manuals and workshop notes. Plans existed for continuing the conversions if the war continued, but with Germany's surrender in May 1945, the programme ended. The vehicles were returned to being what they'd always officially been, damaged jeeps beyond economical repair. Most were scrapped in the summer of 1945. The few that survived into peacetime were gradually broken up or lost to routine disposal of war surplus equipment. The battle wagons left almost no paper trail because they'd never officially existed. They weren't in procurement records because they weren't procured. They weren't in loss reports because they'd already been lost before conversion. They appeared in unit war diaries as armed jeeps, or modified reconnaissance vehicles without detailed documentation. The fullest records come from German sources, intelligence reports describing British light armoured cars, tactical guidance on engaging them, and captured personnel describing vehicles that match no standard British equipment, but that fit the description of improvised battle wagons. What survives is the principle. When equipment is damaged beyond economical repair, don't ask whether it can be restored to original condition. Ask whether it can be made into something useful, when enemy forces have standard recognition training, don't only use standard equipment. Create vehicles that confuse their classifications and trigger responses disproportionate to actual threat. When battlefields are chaotic, remember that what something appears to be can matter as much as what it actually is. The Jeep battle wagons worked not because they were good vehicles by any engineering standard, but because they were exactly what was needed at that moment. Weapons platforms built from scrap that looked dangerous enough to make enemy forces treat them as dangerous, created in field workshops from vehicles the system had already written off as worthless. British forces took American-built reconnaissance vehicles designed for speed and simplicity, added crude armour and heavy weapons, and turned them into improvised fighting vehicles that German forces classified as light armour. This shouldn't have worked. The vehicles were overloaded, unbalanced, poorly protected, and built from damaged chassis. But on the confused battlefields of northwest Europe in 1944–45, they worked remarkably well. Not because they were properly engineered, but because they were properly understood. The difference between those two things is everything.